Welcome back. We are here with Adam Miklosi, and we are going to have a short question and answer period based on the first part. Do you want to talk?
Sure.
Because maybe you're getting.
Yeah. Welcome back, everybody. We are now going to start our question and answer session. And we are going to begin by just asking Adam a little bit about, I guess, how you came to be even looking at these differences between dogs and wolves. So obviously the Family Dog Project's been in place now for probably just over 20 years, but that's pretty recent in the scope of science. So I guess what made you initially want to start focusing on looking at dogs?
Well, I must admit the idea is not mine. So at that time we had a very famous professor who was, by the way, leading the ethology department, William Oschanyi, and it was his idea to start this research. I was at that time working on fish behavior and working on chicks as well, which actually I enjoyed very much. But then was a day, when I had to say goodbye to the fish, and he was really forcing me out of my original research area and saying, okay, let's try something new. And at that time, obviously for a researcher, it was very different because there was no dog research. It was not like today. I mean, probably people can't really imagine that time, because I still remember the first review that we got to our first paper. I think the reviewer asked, who cares about these animals? I mean, why is it interesting to write about this stuff?
It's so funny, isn't it? It's like they're part of our landscape, so embedded in our homes that we didn't even think to
Yeah. So dogs are just around everywhere, and then most ethologists, I mean, Roland Lorenz and many others had many dogs, but nobody had this idea actually to do sort of proper research. I mean, there were stories, observations on dogs, and they are also used for explaining animal behavior in general, but there was no research, and that was also the fear for us. I mean, how should we do that? Because the only thing that we knew that we don't want to do the typical research having dogs like other animals in cages or in facilities and so on, but we would like to understand the dog, how it functions in their natural environment together with the people. So how we do it, we invade the owner's home and then make a little tent in the corner in the kitchen and observe them how you would do it in a classical situation. Obviously that was not possible even at that time. So then we had to invite the owners, but this was also strange for them. But now the method which is a method you can say in one sentence, just invite the owners with their dog to the department or wherever, to the so-called laboratory that looks just basically like a sitting room, and then you just do an experiment. And I think most of the dogs, they enjoy it. I mean, I have stories from owners that the dog starts to pull the leash when they are coming near to the university, because they just like to participate in the new experiment.
Well, to that point, so you have these dogs that are interested and excited and in interacting with us and seeing what we have to offer, essentially this very tame individual. So you talked about this selection for tame behavior probably could happen very quickly. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, I didn't have time to mention this in detail, but we know for that we have relatively good data that a while ago, so probably now it's 80 years ago, there was an applied experiment starting to select for tame foxes in Russia, in Novosibirsk. There was a big research station for geneticists, and they started systematically selecting for those young fox cubs that were showing tame behavior toward a human, and selecting for those. And according to their observations, and this has been published in many papers and then also tested since then, you need about 10-15 generations, not more, for the foxes, that you get markedly different animals with regard to tame behavior.
So it makes sense.
Yeah,
it can happen very quickly.
Now, you touched on this difference between the idea of dogs and people co-evolving versus the idea of parallel evolution. I guess I wanted to just touch on that a little bit more to really talk about, what are they and the effects, and how do we even go about testing and looking at pulling apart those different ideas?
Well, I mean, there is testing coevolution is difficult. Obviously, this evolution happens in a longer time scale, so it's not possible. What you can look at the differences, and obviously in the case what I showed, the genetic change in the production of the toxin and also in the resistance, that could be some clues. In the case of the dogs and the wolves, it's really impossible, and I think nobody has any idea how I would test it genetically, or whether the dog had some specific effect effects on humans. So I think for the time being, I mean, that was my suggestion. I'm not excluding this, but the suggestion is that for the time being, we should not use a word that has been defined for something totally different in the case of our relationship. It doesn't make it worse or not so important if we are not co-evolving. So we're just evolving together in another way.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Do you think there's a reason that people branched or were drawn to this word coevolution?
Yes, because I think they not mix it, but you have the co also in cooperation.
Yeah.
And I think being together, acting together, that's fine. But we are unfortunately not evolving together in the real genetic term. Yeah. So that's the only thing.
So you have had more experience with wolves than either of us have, probably our viewers as well. So is there something, and you also recommended no wolf in the home, no wolf-dog hybrid in the home. Good to know. But something that surprised you about wolf behavior that you might not have thought about?
Well, I think this is what also the video was showing. So for what is really surprising that certain things turn on a wolf being a real animal that is fighting for his survival, and I think it's programmed in that way. And for a wolf, there is no other way to survive, just like behaving that. So you can have the wolf in your lap, and a cup, and interacting, petting, and just licking your face. And if there is the meat coming, just with a switch, it turns it on, and it becomes you would say, fierce animal. But I mean, so I think these yes, and it changes very much, and it happens in many other situations where you can see that, and we can explain. Obviously, this is a more anecdotal that the wolf is doing it because it's, if you like the word, programmed, genetically programmed in that way that gives him a better chance to survive. For example, being territorial also, that's also important, or actually being able to be a lonely animal, which happens to each wolf that survives when it leaves the pack. It has to survive alone for some time before finding the mate. For the dogs, that's not an option. I mean, dogs are always with humans. They don't leave the pack in that way or don't leave the group. So for them to being alone and fight for their lives, it's not such an important trait. And probably this is what has changed in domestication also.
And do you feel that I guess, the way that there's the difference, I guess, in that dogs are attending to us as people, do you think we can generalize out those differences between wolves and dogs to be, I guess, leading back to that key factor of attending to humans?
Well, I think so. That's what I tried to say, that obviously when you are talking about the average dog and the average wolf, which doesn't exist, then I think yes. So and you should expect, and I think this is very important because sometimes people assume that you get a puppy from somewhere and then because it's domesticated, it should love you, it should look at you, yes, but if the person is not at home, I mean, this is not developing from itself. I mean, you really have the interaction. You have to be home. You have to be interacting with the puppy in order to facilitate behavior. It's not automatic. Yeah. So I think this is what makes it possible. Now with the wolf, it's just the other end. I mean, even if you are just interacting with it, it's not enough. For the wolves, you really have to train these behaviors. You really have a very heavy training with food or other means to get this interest toward a human.
And so I guess this fact that when we are selecting for breeds, it affects both the developmental tendencies, the behaviours that we see, but also the social side of things. There's no really splitting out just one of those things to work on, is there? When we affect one, it has that ripple effect that affects the others as well. Is that?
Yes, I mean, probably we will hear more about in terms that if you are selecting for some trait, it has an effect of other traits. So you can't be showing a lot of agonistic tendencies and at the same time being also tame. So if you're selecting for tameness, that probably has an effect of how agonistic tendencies might be organized. So that's, and if you select for a large animal, obviously it will be more stronger than a smaller one, even if you don't want to select for strengths. Yeah. So there are these relationships that constrain what you can do in selection and what happens in evolution as well.
Right. Yeah. So when people bring a dog into their home and they have these expectations about them, how do you think that it's sort of more osmotic? There's just by being in the environment, being present, like how do you think that happens, that they start attending to these components of us?
I think, so we should see that I always usually start from this idea for potential. So dogs have this potential to be interested in what we are doing because they are very open. They regard us as a potential a potential social partner. Now, obviously, we have to behave as a potential, not just to be there. So I think, and I don't know if, and feedback this. So if you are interacting with your dog in a, I mean, you don't have to expect any special thing, but at least interact in a normal way. I mean, they will show this attentiveness or this interest, and obviously there are differences, individual differences, or even breed differences in that sense, because some breeds were selected for being more tuned towards human, others are less. But again, as I mentioned, this is huge variation, so even with that specific breed, you have dogs that are more attending, others that are not so much.
Yeah.
We've got a question that's come through on Twitter from Scott, and he's curious about whether observational learning may have a stronger epigenetic foundation in wolves as a survival mechanism.
Well, it's actually a very interesting question because I really wanted to have one example, a clear example where in a specific situation the wolves show a high performance, and that's also supported by data. But so even social learning, I think, and that's what nobody has done so far, or there are some results, when the demonstrator is a human, the situation might change, because looking at the human or what the human is doing, it could be more interesting for a dog. Right. So in that experiments, and we have lots of experiments with dogs learning from humans, but we don't really have a lot of comparative experiments with the wolves. So there where the dogs are attentive, then they are watching or are showing some interest. And I'm quite sure that in a dog-human context, dogs are learning a lot from the owner. And I think this is also, we worked on that and developed a whole method to teach the dog to learn from a human. And then that way you can also enhance their knowledge, but also I think this social learning offers you a way to interact. It's not just observing something and the dog is watching, but actually how you interact with the dog. Okay, I show you something, you can do it. You show me something, I can do it. So this is a part of a social interaction.
It's a reminder that every interaction that we have with our dogs is actually a learning experience for them, isn't it?
Yes.
And that even something we may think is flippant or an aside could be quite meaningful from the dog's perspective and what it's learning about how it relates to us.
Yes.
Kind of the same in our interactions with humans.
I thought you were going to say with me.
Yeah, with you. So since you have done this comprehensive work with both dogs and wolves, what does everybody want to know? What's the question you're asked the most?
Well, I mean, I think we touched upon most of this question. Okay. So I think really that's the interest between what makes a dog, and also what I always try to explain is I think what I also already mentioned, that you should not expect a dog automatically developing into a dog without having any effect on it. Yeah. So I think people should really, and people are uncertain. I think this is why, because there is now, especially in the modern societies, I mean, people don't have enough experience with interacting even with children, or they don't remember their childhood and so on, or they don't have experience with animals in general. So therefore they are inexperienced, they don't know how to deal with this little thing that they are suddenly find in the living room. So I think this is where we have to encourage them, that just be a person, try to interact in your social way, using your social signals, and the dog will understand that for sure.
I think we've probably just got time for one more quick question before we have another break and then come back with the second part of your presentation. You commented at the beginning of this session a little bit about being able to observe the dogs in the natural home environment, so our animal companion dogs that are living with us in our homes, and being a researcher wanting to spy on the wall and that. I guess over the course of 20 years, we've seen quite a change in technology that's been able to enable that to happen more readily and more easily. How have you found that change in technology has affected the research you are able to do?
Well, this is, again, an interesting question. I am not an expert in technology, but I like advances in science. So what we are also considering now, and there are some other people doing it, is to put some sensors on the dogs, and by using these sensors, which are basically sensing how the dog is moving and speed of and turns and so on, how we can describe the behavior in an automatic way. And this helps, or this might help. I mean, we are not there yet, although there are some companies are claiming such things, but you have to be cautious of buying these.
These are kind of activity trackers, aren't they? Yes. Similar to like a
Yeah.
Fitbit or something for a person
Yes.
that shows us when a dog's moving around, where it's moving, if it's resting.
Yes, but I think it's more for ornithologists. It's more interesting whether we could really be more specific to not just having moving or not moving, but rather even sleeping or staying, setting, playing. So getting into a more varied description of the behavior. And I think in a few years, I mean maybe 5 years, we will be there, and it helps a lot because you can collect a lot of data, and that helps the analysis later.
Yeah, fantastic. It's an exciting time.
It is. So we are going to be back with Dr. Adam Miklosi in 5 minutes and to finish the second half of your talk. So thank you for this Q&A.
Thank you.
Okay.